Welcome back to Wartime Whispers. Tonight, we journey to December 1944, to the frozen forests of Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge. This is the story of Kampfgruppe Peiper, Germany's most elite armored spearhead, and a discovery that revealed the true nature of the war they were fighting. A story about 50,000 gallons of fuel that seemed like salvation, but proved to be nothing at all. Get comfortable, relax, and let's begin. December 17th, 1944. 05:30 hours. Hansfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed, sputtered, then died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch, the metallic clang echoing through the pre-dawn darkness. His driver, Unterscharführer Weber, attempted to restart the 700 horsepower Maybach engine. The starter motor whined. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. The fuel gauge read empty. Herr Obersturmbannführer. Weber called up from his compartment, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. The reserve tank is also dry. Peiper climbed down from his command tank, his boots crunching on the frozen Belgian soil. The temperature hovered near freezing. His breath formed clouds in the air. Around him, the most powerful armored spearhead the Wehrmacht had assembled for Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes offensive, sat motionless in the gray morning light. 67 tanks, including the fearsome King Tigers and Panthers. 149 half-tracks carrying elite Panzer Grenadiers, and nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers, veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of brutal combat, all paralyzed by empty fuel tanks. Through the morning mist, Peiper could see the abandoned American position ahead. Hansfeld, a small Belgian village that had served as a critical supply depot for the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. The Americans had fled so quickly they'd left fires still burning in oil drums for warmth, coffee still hot in metal cups, sitting on makeshift tables, half-eaten rations scattered across wooden crates. The signs of panicked evacuation were everywhere. And there, lined up in the village square like a gift from the gods of war themselves, stood rows upon rows of jerry cans, thousands of them. The distinctive olive-drab American fuel containers, each marked with a white star. They were stacked in pyramids, organized in neat military precision, stretching as far as Peiper could see in the dim light. Peiper approached slowly, almost reverently, as if the fuel might disappear if he moved too quickly. His adjutant, Hauptsturmführer Hans Grühle, hurried ahead and pried open one can with his combat knife. He sniffed the contents, then looked up at his commander with wide eyes. Benzin, Herr Obersturmbannführer. High-octane gasoline. American quality. As his men began the frantic work of refueling their vehicles, their movements quick and desperate, after hours of anxiety about their dwindling supplies, Peiper walked slowly among the stockpile. He counted the rows, calculated the stacks, did the mathematics in his head. The numbers were staggering. 50,000 gallons. Perhaps more, enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe for the push to the Meuse River. Enough to potentially change the course of the offensive. Enough to reach Antwerp if luck held. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single, relatively minor depot than most German divisions had received in the past 6 months of desperate rationing. His logistics officer, Hauptsturmführer Ernst Knittel, appeared at his side with a notebook, frantically calculating. Herr Obersturmbannführer, with this quantity, we can reach our objectives. We can push through to the bridges. This changes everything. But as Peiper stood among this bounty, watching his exhausted men pour American fuel into German tanks with trembling hands, their faces showing relief mixed with something else, confusion, perhaps shock, a crushing realization, settled over him like the morning fog rolling through the Ardennes valleys. If the Americans could afford to abandon such quantities, if they could leave behind in a hasty retreat what Germany would guard with entire divisions, what the Wehrmacht High Command would consider a strategic reserve, then this war was already over. Germany hadn't just miscalculated the strength of Allied forces or the timing of their counteroffensive. Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy. The mathematics were too stark to ignore. The abundance too complete to dismiss as luck or accident. 6 months before Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented the Führer with a report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. The document, stamped "Most Secret" and bound in red leather, contained page after page of devastating statistics. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht, the carefully constructed system that was supposed to free Germany from dependence on foreign oil, had been systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. The numbers told a story of systematic annihilation. The Leuna works in Saxony-Anhalt, once the pride of German chemical engineering, had produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April 1944. By September, after repeated Allied bombing raids, it managed only 5,000 tons, a 97% reduction. The massive Buna hydrogenation plants at Politz, Bleckhammer, and Brucks were operating at less than 10% capacity. The refineries at Ploiești in Romania, Germany's last source of natural petroleum, had been bombed into near uselessness. The numbers told a story of inevitable defeat, if anyone had the courage to read them honestly. In 1944, the United States alone produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic production, all captured facilities in occupied territories, and the damaged Romanian fields, managed 33 million barrels. Less than 2% of American production. Not two-thirds, not half. Not even 10%. 2%. The Third Reich, which had built its military doctrine around mechanized warfare, around the revolutionary concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war powered by tanks and aircraft, was attempting to wage that same mechanized warfare with horse-drawn logistics. By late 1944, the German army had more horses than any army since the Napoleonic Wars. Over 2.7 million horses were in Wehrmacht service, pulling supply wagons, artillery pieces, and ambulances. Meanwhile, America was drowning its armies in petroleum abundance that German planners literally could not comprehend. Major Friedrich Siemann of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command, a career officer who had spent years studying supply operations, had calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. This was based on standard German consumption rates, accounting for the difficult terrain, winter conditions, and expected combat intensity. Hitler, in one of the final planning meetings at the Wolf's Lair, had reviewed Siemens' calculations and allocated 5 million gallons, a seemingly generous cushion of 500,000 gallons above the minimum requirement. The Führer had seemed pleased with his own logistics acumen, but only half of that allocation, 2.5 million gallons, was actually delivered to forward units due to transportation problems, Allied air attacks on fuel trains, and the simple reality that Germany didn't have 5 million gallons to allocate. In the first place, the German High Command was betting the entire offensive, the last major German attack of the war, on capturing enemy supplies, not as a bonus, not as a helpful supplement, but as the primary fuel source. The plan wasn't built on German logistics, supporting German forces. It was built on stealing American logistics. This wasn't strategy. This was a strategy that revealed terminal weakness rather than strength. The Americans, meanwhile, had constructed a petroleum pipeline system across France that German engineers considered impossible. The system was called Pluto, Pipeline Under the Ocean. Engineers had laid flexible pipes across the English Channel from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, pumping fuel under 20 miles of ocean. The pipes could deliver over 1 million gallons per day. Beyond Pluto, the Americans had created the Red Ball Express, a massive truck convoy system named after the railway signals for express freight. 6,000 trucks operated around the clock by drivers who worked in rotating shifts delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the front lines. The trucks traveled on one-way routes to prevent collisions, with white soldiers driving north on one road and black soldiers driving south on another, because even in their logistical operations, the Americans maintained racial segregation, yet still achieved efficiencies Germany couldn't match. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day. This number alone exceeded Germany's monthly allocation to the entire Western Front. But more tellingly, they were receiving 1.4 million gallons per day. They weren't just meeting consumption. They were accumulating reserves while fighting. They were getting richer while spending. Joachim Peiper was not a fool, despite what Allied propaganda might suggest. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest military decorations. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, where he had learned lessons about modern warfare that most of the old guard refused to accept. On the steppes of Russia, Peiper had learned that in modern mechanized warfare, fuel was more precious than ammunition, more valuable than courage, more decisive than tactical brilliance. His Kampfgruppe, a flexible combat group built around his 1st SS Panzer Regiment, had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes offensive. The word literally meant hard point or heavy point, but in German military doctrine, it meant something more profound. The point where all force would be concentrated, where breakthrough must occur, where success or failure would be determined. On December 14th, 2 days before the offensive was scheduled to begin, Peiper attended the final briefing at the castle in Tondorf. The room was filled with SS officers in their black uniforms, Wehrmacht generals in field gray, and staff officers with maps spread across every available surface. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was characteristically blunt. Dietrich was not known for political niceties or careful phrasing. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies," Dietrich had said, pointing at the map with a riding crop. "The Americans are soft. They retreat quickly. They leave everything behind. You will find what you need." The words hung in the air. If you capture American supplies. The entire operation depended on an if. The fuel allocation for Kampfgruppe Peiper was 31,000 gallons total. Peiper had done the calculations immediately. His Tigers consumed 2.5 gallons per mile. His Panthers burned 1.5 gallons per mile. The half-tracks, trucks, and armored cars added more consumption. In the difficult Ardennes terrain, narrow roads, steep hills, dense forests, consumption would increase by 30 to 40%. The 31,000 gallons was enough for approximately 50 miles of combat operations, accounting for idling, maneuvering, and battle. The distance from his start line near the German border to the Meuse River was 65 miles, and Antwerp, the ultimate objective that would cut off the Allied armies and potentially change the course of the war, was 120 miles. The mathematics of failure were built into the plan from the beginning. Success required capturing enemy fuel depots. Not might require, required. It was built into the operational orders as a necessity, not a contingency. As his column prepared to advance on December 16th, Peiper issued strict orders to his company commanders. Tanks would operate in single file on the roads to conserve fuel by reducing unnecessary maneuvering. Engines would be shut off during any halt longer than 5 minutes, despite the difficulty of restarting cold engines in winter conditions. Half-tracks would tow disabled vehicles rather than leaving them behind. And most critically, the capture of American fuel dumps was designated as Priority 1, above even tactical objectives, above even the capture of bridges or crossroads. The contrast with American operations that same morning could not have been starker. Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion, stationed just 20 miles from Peiper's starting position near Losheim, recorded in his unit diary with the casual tone of routine logistics. Received fuel resupply, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks already at capacity, considering requests to refuse further deliveries until we have storage space. One side was planning its entire offensive around stealing fuel. The other was considering refusing deliveries because they had too much. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, shattered the winter morning across an 80-mile front. Over 600 artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The sound was described by American soldiers as like 1,000 freight trains passing overhead. The barrage used more ammunition in the first 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations earlier in the war. But even this impressive display of firepower masked critical shortages in other areas. Peiper's column began moving at 7 a.m., already behind schedule. The roads, which on German maps captured from Belgian surveys appeared as proper highways, were narrow country lanes in reality. Many were unpaved, some were little more than farm tracks. The massive King Tiger tanks, weighing 70 tons, could barely navigate the turns. Within hours, traffic jams developed as vehicles designed for the open terrain of the Russian steppes struggled through the dense Ardennes forest. At Lanzerath, Peiper's first objective, a small village that should have been swept aside in minutes, they encountered unexpected resistance. A single American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Infantry Division, just 18 men under the command of First Lieutenant Lyle Buck, had dug in on a hillside overlooking the approaches. Those 18 men held up the most powerful German armored column, over 5,000 elite soldiers with tank support, for nearly 10 hours. They had excellent fields of fire and refused to retreat. Peiper's infantry had to conduct a careful assault, taking casualties they couldn't afford. During the delay, while the battle developed, Peiper's vehicles sat idling in column, their engines running to keep them operational in the cold, burning precious fuel to produce nothing but carbon monoxide and wasted time. When they finally broke through and reached Honsfeld at dawn on December 17th, Peiper's column had covered only 20 miles, less than a third of the distance to the Meuse, and had consumed 40% of their total fuel allocation. At this rate, even without enemy resistance, they would run dry before reaching the halfway point to their objective. The mathematics were becoming undeniable. The American supply depot at Honsfeld was not even a primary facility. It wasn't a major logistics hub or a strategic fuel reserve. It was a forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division, what the U.S. Army classified in its logistics manual as a Class 3B depot, essentially a temporary fuel station. In American military logistics, this was the equivalent of a gas station, not a refinery. Yet what Peiper found there exceeded the monthly fuel allocation for an entire German panzer division. Hauptsturmführer Hans Grühle later testified during war crimes investigations in 1946. We found pyramids of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked 3 meters high, in rows that extended for perhaps 200 meters. The organization was impressive. Everything labeled, everything accounted for. The Americans had not even attempted to destroy them, despite having at least an hour's warning of our approach. It was as if the fuel meant nothing to them. The captured fuel was high-octane, aviation gasoline mixed with standard motor fuel, 80 octane or higher. This was significant because German vehicles, especially the temperamental Maybach engines in the Tiger tanks, were designed for 74 octane fuel. The German synthetic fuel production process couldn't achieve higher octanes efficiently. The American gasoline was actually too good for German engines, causing problems with engine timing and combustion that would plague Peiper's column for the rest of the offensive. Several vehicles developed engine knock and required adjustment. As Peiper's men refueled with desperate efficiency, forming bucket brigades to speed the process, they made more discoveries that painted a picture of American logistics that seemed almost fantastical. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, a pre-war import-export clerk who had studied English in school, found shipping manifests in the abandoned depot office. The papers were still on the desk, left behind in the hasty American retreat. The manifests, stamped with shipping dates and routing information, told a remarkable story. This fuel had been shipped from refineries in Texas to the port of New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool in tanker convoys, across the Channel to Normandy beachheads, and then trucked over 400 miles through France and Belgium to Honsfeld. The total journey exceeded 6,000 miles. The elapsed time from refinery to frontline depot was less than 6 weeks. I showed the papers to Obersturmbannführer Peiper, Hoffmann recalled in a 1976 interview, his voice still carrying the weight of that moment. He read them carefully twice, then crumpled them up and threw them on the floor. He said nothing for perhaps a full minute, but his face went pale. We both understood what this meant. The Americans could move fuel 6,000 miles faster than we could move it 200 miles. Private Ernst Krog, meanwhile, found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The front page celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Virden, capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline, one of many in the American system, delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would consume in the entire offensive. Another article in the same newspaper casually mentioned that American fuel stockpiles in France had reached 140 million gallons. This single number, mentioned as routine logistics information, exceeded Germany's entire strategic fuel reserve for all fronts combined. To comprehend the true shock of Peiper's discovery, one must understand Germany's fuel situation by late 1944. The situation wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic in ways that were being hidden even from most German military commanders. Since May 1944, Allied bombing of synthetic fuel plants had reduced production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding entire fighter wings for lack of aviation fuel, leaving German cities defenseless against Allied bombers. Pilot training programs had been cut from 250 flight hours, already barely adequate, to 60 hours. German pilots were going into combat with less training than Allied pilots received for basic certification. The German Navy's surface fleet had effectively ceased operations. The battleship Tirpitz sat immobile in Norwegian fjords, not because of damage or lack of crew, but because there was no fuel for operations. U-boats, Germany's last effective naval weapon, were being fitted with snorkels to allow them to run on electric batteries longer, conserving diesel fuel that could barely be spared. On the home front, German civilians had not seen private automobile traffic since 1942. The last civilian cars had been requisitioned or simply abandoned when fuel rations ceased. Gasoline was so precious that the Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, conducted investigations into black market theft of individual liters. A single gallon of gasoline on the black market cost more than a month's wages for a factory worker. Farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows, abandoning tractors they couldn't fuel. Germany, the nation that had pioneered chemical engineering and synthetic fuels, was regressing technologically. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 77% of the world's oil. The East Texas oil field alone, a single geological formation, produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined, including the captured Romanian fields. American refineries were operating at such excess capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts, simply because they had surplus crude oil and were looking for new markets. American gasoline was so abundant that it was being used for purposes that would have been considered criminally wasteful in Germany. GIs used gasoline to start fires, to clean equipment, even to heat water for shaving. Tank crews ran their engines for hours just to stay warm. The waste was casual, thoughtless, built into every aspect of operations. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Hunsfeld, Peiper's column surged forward with renewed energy. The relief among his men was palpable. They had been hours away from complete immobilization. They reached Billingen by noon on December 17th, overwhelming the small American garrison there. At Billingen, they captured additional supplies, rations, ammunition, medical supplies. But most importantly, they found detailed American maps showing other fuel depot locations in the area. The maps were marked with standard American military symbology, and Peiper's intelligence officer could read them easily. What the maps revealed was disturbing. The Americans had fuel stockpiles everywhere, not just at major bases or logistics hubs, but at every significant crossroads, every road junction, every small town that might serve as a resupply point. The density of fuel depots was extraordinary. In the American system, fuel was treated like ammunition. distributed forward in abundance so units would never need to worry about supply. The U.S. First Army alone, according to captured logistics summaries, maintained reserves of 3.5 million gallons within its operational area. This was just one army. The Americans had 3 armies in Northwest Europe. Peiper pushed his column forward toward Ligneville. The road wound through valleys and forest. American resistance was sporadic but determined. At Ligneville, a confrontation occurred that would haunt Peiper for the rest of his life. His forces encountered a column of American prisoners, soldiers from various units who had been captured during the rapid German advance. In an incident that became known as the Malmedy Massacre, though it occurred at Ligneville and nearby Baugny Crossroads, 84 American prisoners were shot. The details remain disputed. Peiper later claimed he could not spare fuel or vehicles to transport prisoners, a claim that, while horrifying, reveals how fuel shortage influenced every decision, even war crimes. Other accounts suggest the killings were more deliberate. Whatever the truth, the massacre would lead to Peiper's war crimes conviction and imprisonment after the war. By evening on December 17th, Peiper's spearhead reached the outskirts of Stavelot, a town of significant strategic importance because it housed a major American fuel depot. Intelligence reports suggested the depot contained over 2 million gallons. 2 million gallons. Here was enough fuel to not just reach the Meuse, but to guarantee reaching Antwerp, enough to fuel the entire 6th SS Panzer Army for weeks. The prize that could vindicate the entire offensive. But as the first German vehicles approached Stavelot in the failing December light, American engineers were already at work. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning of the German approach approximately 45 minutes earlier. Radio traffic had been frantic, reports of German tanks, American units falling back, a breakthrough in progress. His orders, transmitted directly from First Army headquarters, were simple and unambiguous. Deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. The Stavelot depot contained exactly 289,000 gallons of gasoline, stored in jerry cans stacked across 15 acres of ground. The cans were organized in pyramids, each pyramid containing approximately 200 cans, each can holding 5 gallons. There were over 400,000 individual jerry cans. At 16:30 on December 17th, as Peiper's advance guard entered the outskirts of Stavelot, Captain Brewster gave the order to his engineers. His men knew what to do. They had trained for this contingency, though most had assumed they would never actually have to execute it. Engineers ran between the pyramids of fuel cans, pouring gasoline trails to connect the stacks. White phosphorus grenades, chosen because they would ignite even in wet conditions, were distributed to team leaders. Technical Sergeant Paul Hinkle, a farmer from Iowa before the war, threw the first grenade into the center of the depot. The explosion was immediate and tremendous, he recalled in a 1967 interview. The white phosphorus ignited the gasoline instantly. A wall of fire shot up, maybe 100 feet high. The heat was so intense we had to run. Within seconds, the entire depot was burning. The roar was like standing inside a blast furnace. Within 3 minutes, the entire 15-acre site was an inferno. The heat could be felt half a mile away. Peiper's lead tanks, a platoon of Panthers advancing cautiously through Stavelot's narrow streets, arrived to find a pillar of black smoke rising over 1,000 feet into the winter sky. The fire would burn for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to have powered Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back, with enough left over to fuel defensive operations for a month. Unterscharführer Weber, Peiper's driver, described the scene in his 1975 memoir. The Obersturmbannführer climbed out of the tank and stood on the turret, just watching the flames. I could see them reflected in his eyes. He said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes. None of us spoke. We just watched millions of liters burn. Then he climbed down and told me quietly, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us. Weber, what are we doing here? This war is over." It was the first time I heard him say such a thing. Across the Ardennes, the same scene was repeating. American engineers, following standing orders to deny supplies to the enemy, were destroying fuel dumps rather than risk capture. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spa, where First Army headquarters was located, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed as headquarters personnel evacuated. At Malmedy, 800,000 gallons went up in flames. At Werbomont, another 600,000 gallons were denied to the Germans. In total, during the first week of the Ardennes offensive, Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel. Not lost to enemy capture, destroyed, burned, made useless. 8 million gallons. More than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. More than the Wehrmacht consumed on all fronts in a typical month by late 1944. The ability to casually destroy millions of gallons was rooted in a supply system beyond German comprehension. The scale was so vast that individual depots, even large ones, were expendable. The Red Ball Express had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies since August, using 6,000 trucks operating round the clock. Each truck consumed 40 gallons of fuel daily just for operations. The Red Ball Express itself, the supply system, burned more fuel in its daily operations than German Army Group B received monthly for combat operations. The trucks were driven by soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps, many of them African Americans in segregated units. They drove in convoys, headlights on even at night, because the Allies had such complete air superiority that German night fighters posed minimal threat. The drivers worked 12-hour shifts, slept in their trucks, and then drove another 12 hours. The system operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By December 1944, the Motor Transport Service employed 230 truck companies operating on color-coded routes: Red Ball, White Ball, ABC routes, XYZ routes, each designated by colored markers and dedicated to specific supply categories. The system delivered 20,000 tons of supplies daily to the front lines, including 3,000 tons of fuel. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for First Army, recorded in his personal diary on December 18th with the dry tone of routine accounting. Fuel receipts yesterday, 147,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,693,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves, 24,000 gallons. Weather improving, expect higher delivery rates tomorrow. The pipeline system was even more impressive in its ambition and execution. Operation Pluto had laid flexible pipes across the English Channel, an engineering achievement the Germans had dismissed as impossible. The pipes pumped 1 million gallons daily from British refineries to Cherbourg. From Cherbourg, a network of pipelines extended inland. The Cherbourg-Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine line moved 650,000 gallons. A network of smaller distribution pipes connected to forward depots. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons of fuel daily for all purposes: combat vehicles, transport trucks, aircraft, generators, heating, and countless other uses. They were receiving 8.2 million gallons daily. The difference, 700,000 gallons per day, was being added to strategic reserves. They were getting richer while spending freely. They were building reserves during offensive operations, something German logistics officers would have considered mathematically impossible. As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the fundamental impossibility of the German position became increasingly clear with each mile traveled. At La Glaise, a small town perched on hills overlooking the Amblève River, they captured another small American supply point, 5,000 gallons. In the broader context of the American logistics system, this was nothing. A rounding error, a gas station. For Peiper's column, it was 3 hours of operation. It was consumed in the fighting to take the town and prepare defenses. Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile in combat operations. Panthers burned 1.5 gallons per mile. Half-tracks used 1 gallon per mile. In the difficult Ardennes terrain, with its steep hills, narrow roads requiring constant gear changes, and combat conditions requiring maneuvering, consumption increased by 40%. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Hauptmann Otto Dingler, maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, kept meticulous records of fuel consumption. His war diary, captured by American forces in January 1945, provides stark documentation. By noon on December 18th, we had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began 48 hours earlier. We had captured approximately 55,000 gallons at Hansfeld, plus perhaps 8,000 gallons at other small depots. We were operating at a net deficit of 4,000 gallons. At this rate, we would be immobilized within 24 hours. The Americans, monitoring German radio traffic through ultra-intercepts, the Allied code-breaking operation that had decrypted German communications, knew Peiper's fuel situation with remarkable precision. They could read his supply requests, his position reports, even his personal communications. General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, issued an order to all units on December 18th. Enemy advance units critically short of fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened by capture. Deny enemy all supplies. That same day, December 18th, American C-47 transport aircraft flew 316 sorties delivering supplies to Bastogne, which was becoming surrounded by German forces. The supplies included ammunition, medical supplies, food, and 160,000 gallons of fuel delivered in jerry cans via parachute. Americans were flying more fuel to a surrounded garrison, delivering it through the air at tremendous expense than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed. The contrast was almost absurd in its completeness. One side measuring every liter, the other flying fuel through the sky. By December 19th, as Peiper's forces engaged American defenders from the 30th Infantry Division at Stoumont, a small town that controlled the approach to the Meuse bridges, the fuel crisis had become critical and undeniable. Tanks were being abandoned along the roads with empty fuel tanks rather than from battle damage. The powerful machines, the most advanced armored vehicles in the German arsenal, were sitting immobile like monuments, their crews destroying them with demolition charges rather than leave them intact for the enemy. Peiper called his company commanders together for a meeting in a commandeered house in L'Église. The meeting has been documented through multiple sources: testimony at Nuremberg trials, post-war interviews, and personal diaries. Sturmbannführer Werner Puchke, commanding a Panzergrenadier battalion, was characteristically blunt. "We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers of operations," Puchke reported, consulting his notes. "The Meuse is 30 kilometers away. We cannot reach our objective. We cannot even execute a proper fighting retreat to our start lines. We lack fuel for that as well." According to Hauptsturmführer Grüle's sworn testimony at Peiper's war crimes trial, the Obersturmbannführer was quiet for several minutes after hearing the reports from his subordinates. Then he said, "Gentlemen, we have discovered something in these 3 days. We are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Hansfeld, which seemed miraculous to us, was nothing to them. A minor depot they didn't even bother to defend or destroy properly. We cannot win this war. We cannot win this battle. The only question now is how we survive it." This realization was spreading through German command. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army to the south of Peiper's position, later wrote in his memoirs, "When I learned on December 19th that the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it began. We were fighting an enemy who viewed millions of gallons as expendable. How could we win?" Colonel Friedrich von der Heite, a Fallschirmjäger officer who was captured on December 23rd after his parachute operation behind American lines failed, provided revealing testimony during his interrogation. His words, recorded by American intelligence officers, captured the psychological impact of American abundance. "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You leave K-rations half-eaten. We consider them delicacies. You burn millions of gallons of fuel to deny them to us. We measure by the liter. You fire artillery barrages for registration. We save artillery shells for certain targets. How can we fight such abundance? The answer is we cannot. Every German soldier who saw your casual waste knew the war was hopeless. By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded at L'Église, his tanks immobile, his men exhausted. American forces surrounding him included the 119th Infantry Regiment of the 30th Division, elements of the 82nd Airborne Division, which had rushed north from reserve positions, and the 3rd Armored Division. These American units surrounding Kampfgruppe Peiper had a combined fuel allocation for December 21st, alone of 340,000 gallons, 1 day's allocation. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons total for his entire force. Private First Class. Richard McKinney of the 30th Infantry Division wrote a letter home on December 21st that captured the absurd disparity. We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Just sat there until we closed in. Our captain made a joke. He said we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for their tanks. It's probably true. There's supposed to be this elite SS unit, but they just ran out of gas. The American response to the German offensive demonstrated industrial warfare at its peak efficiency. When General George Patton received orders on December 19th to disengage his Third Army from operations in the Saar and pivot north to relieve Bastogne, a maneuver requiring the movement of over 250,000 men and 133,000 vehicles through winter conditions, the fuel requirement was staggering. The redeployment consumed 350,000 gallons. Just for movement, not including combat operations. By German standards of late 1944, this was impossible. Moving an entire army 90 degrees across the rear areas of other armies, in winter in 3 days. German staff officers, when they learned of this maneuver after the war, initially refused to believe it had been accomplished so quickly. They assumed the timeline was propaganda. Yet Patton's Third Army completed the pivot in exactly 3 days and attacked toward Bastogne on December 22nd with full fuel reserves. The Americans had moved faster through difficult terrain than seemed physically possible, simply because they had unlimited fuel to support continuous movement. December 23rd brought clear weather for the first time since the offensive began. The break in the clouds, which had grounded Allied aircraft for the first week, was devastating for German forces. Allied aircraft flew over 2,000 sorties on December 23rd alone. P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, British Typhoons, and medium bombers filled the sky. Each P-47 consumed 300 gallons of fuel per hour of flight. Flying a typical 4-hour combat mission, takeoff, flight to target area, combat patrol, and return. Each aircraft burned 1,200 gallons. The 2,000 sorties on December 23rd consumed over 2 million gallons of aviation fuel. 1 day's air operations consumed more than Germany's entire offensive allocation. B-26 Martin Marauders, medium bombers attacking German supply lines, burned 200 gallons per hour per aircraft. The fuel expenditure for air operations alone exceeded what the entire Wehrmacht consumed on the ground. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, could barely launch 100 sorties due to fuel shortages, and many of those aircraft were piloted by undertrained pilots who were shot down quickly. On the night of December 23rd to 24th, Peiper made his decision. He called his officers together one final time in the basement of a house in L'Église. The building shook periodically from American artillery fire. Outside, his remaining vehicles, Tigers, Panthers, half-tracks, all the pride of German armored warfare, sat silent and useless. "We are abandoning all vehicles and breaking out on foot," Peiper announced. "Destroy anything that can't be carried. We leave tonight." Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that had begun the offensive with Kampfgruppe Peiper on December 16th, 39 remained operational in terms of mechanical condition, but all 39 were immobilized by empty fuel tanks. These vehicles, representing millions of Reichsmarks in equipment and years of industrial production that Germany could not replace, would be destroyed with demolition charges and abandoned. Oberscharführer Heinz Goltz, a tank commander, described the scene in a 1968 interview. "We drained the last fuel from all vehicles, maybe 200 gallons total when we pooled everything. It wasn't enough to move even one tank any useful distance. The Obersturmbannführer personally placed demolition charges in his command tank. I watched millions of Reichsmarks of equipment being destroyed, not by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks, the most powerful tanks in the world, abandoned because we couldn't fuel them." That night, December 23rd to 24th, approximately 770 men of Kampfgruppe Peiper escaped through American lines on foot, moving through the dark forests, leaving behind their vehicles, their heavy weapons, most of their wounded. Of the nearly 5,000 men who had begun the offensive, this remnant represented all that remained. They had advanced 60 miles into Allied-held territory. They had captured several supply depots. They had created panic in the American rear areas, and they had discovered the truth about Allied logistics, that Germany was fighting an enemy operating on a scale of abundance that made German scarcity irrelevant. News of Peiper's discoveries and the fuel crisis spread rapidly through German command channels. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, received comprehensive reports on captured American supplies and Allied logistics capabilities. The reports had been compiled by intelligence officers analyzing captured documents, interrogating prisoners, and assessing the American supply system based on observed capabilities. Model's Chief of Staff, General Major Karl Wagner, recorded Model's reaction in his diary. The Field Marshal read the quantities twice, asking me to verify the numbers. 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld, 2 million gallons burned at Stavelot, 8 million gallons destroyed rather than captured across the offensive area. American daily consumption, 7.5 million gallons. American daily receipts, 8.2 million gallons. The Field Marshal was silent for several minutes. Then he said, "We are not fighting the same war. They are fighting an industrial war. We are fighting with rifles and courage. Rifles and courage cannot defeat factories and oil fields." Hitler, when informed of these same figures on December 28th, refused to accept the reality the numbers represented. Albert Speer, who was present at the meeting, wrote in his memoirs, "Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda, that the Americans were inflating figures to demoralize us. When I showed him photographs of the burning depot at Stavelot, taken by German reconnaissance aircraft, he claimed it could be Hollywood effects, that the Americans were masters of illusion. He refused to believe that any nation could be so wasteful as to burn millions of gallons simply to deny them to us." But lower ranks, the men who had seen American abundance firsthand, understood the truth. Grenadier Wilhelm Hoffmann, who had found the shipping manifests at Hansfeld, wrote to his wife on December 27th, in a letter that was intercepted by German censors but preserved in files, "The Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks the way we march, casually, without thought to conservation. They leave engines running for warmth. They use gasoline for 100 purposes we would never imagine. This war is lost, not because we lack courage or skill, but because we lack everything else." The fuel crisis that destroyed Kampfgruppe Peiper was symptomatic of a larger truth about World War II by late 1944. The war had become a contest, not of tactics or courage or even strategy, but of industrial capacity. And in industrial capacity, the disparity between the Allies and Germany was so vast as to be almost incomprehensible. By 1944, the United States alone was producing 50% of the world's total manufacturing output. American factories were producing a new aircraft every 5 minutes, around the clock. A Liberty ship, a 10,000-ton cargo vessel, was being launched every day. A tank rolled off American assembly lines every 7 minutes, but petroleum production statistics were the most overwhelming. The numbers told a story of complete dominance. The United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944. The Soviet Union, recovering from German occupation of its western oil fields, produced 110 million barrels. Germany, including all synthetic production, captured Romanian fields, and smaller occupied sources, managed 33 million barrels. Japan, desperately short of oil after the loss of the Dutch East Indies, produced 2.6 million barrels from remaining sources. The Axis powers combined, Germany, Japan, and what remained of Italy, produced less than 2% of American petroleum output. 2%, not 20%, not even 10%, 2%. This disparity meant that every major German offensive after 1942 had been fundamentally constrained by fuel availability. Operation Blue in 1942, the offensive toward the Caucasus oil fields, had been driven by fuel desperation as much as strategic planning. By 1943, German forces in Russia were frequently immobilized for lack of fuel. By 1944, fuel shortages were affecting every aspect of military operations. Meanwhile, every American offensive was supported by abundance that German planners literally couldn't conceive. American commanders didn't plan operations around fuel availability. Fuel was assumed. It was background. It was unlimited for planning purposes. Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen, aide to General Omar Bradley, recorded a revealing incident in his diary on December 27th. At morning briefing, a logistics officer reported weather had reduced fuel deliveries to only 500,000 gallons daily. There was brief concern about whether this would affect operations until someone noted this still exceeded Germany's total offensive allocation. Everyone laughed. We'd been worried about a shortage that was twice what the Germans had for their entire offensive. German prisoners of war from the Ardennes offensive, when interrogated by American intelligence officers, were consistently more shocked by American waste than by American firepower. The abundance, the casual disposal of resources, the thoughtless expenditure, this shattered German morale more effectively than artillery barrages. Gefreiter Hans Reichhelm, captured near Bastogne on December 27th, told his interrogator something that appeared in multiple intelligence reports. We knew your production numbers in abstract. We'd been told America produced more tanks, more aircraft, but these were just numbers. Seeing your soldiers throw away half-eaten rations, seeing them waste gasoline, seeing them fire artillery for no particular reason, that made it real. Every German who saw your casual abundance knew the war was hopeless. You waste more than we have. This knowledge spread through letters despite military censorship. Feldwebel Ernst Müller wrote to his family in early January 1945, in a letter that was intercepted but preserved. The Americans wash their clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery barrages on Christmas Day just for celebration. They use fuel for heat that we would save for tanks. We cannot fight infinity. We are fighting an enemy who has so much they don't know what to do with it all. The psychological impact of this abundance undermined the entire German racial superiority narrative that the Nazi regime had built its ideology upon. How could the decadent Americans, the mixed-race democracy that German propaganda ridiculed, possess such overwhelming material wealth? How could the supposedly superior German people be reduced to measuring fuel by the liter, while Americans burned it by the millions of gallons? German soldiers returning from the West brought these stories east. The Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front heard about American abundance. The disconnect between ideology and reality created a crisis of confidence that affected morale as much as military defeats. During the Nuremberg trials in 1946, German military leaders consistently cited logistics, particularly fuel, as the decisive factor in Germany's defeat. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, German Armed Forces High Command, testified, "We had operational superiority in 1940 and 1941. Superior tactics, superior training, adequate equipment. By 1944, we couldn't move forces effectively for lack of fuel, while Americans moved entire armies like chess pieces. The war became unwinnable not because of tactics, but because of mathematics." Joachim Peiper, on trial for the Malmedy massacre, offered testimony that was both a defense and an explanation. Every decision I made after December 17th was influenced by fuel shortage. We couldn't maneuver properly. We couldn't pursue defeated enemies. We couldn't execute tactical retreats effectively. The Americans moved freely, wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. We counted every leader. I cannot excuse what happened at Malmedy, but you must understand the desperation, the knowledge that we were already defeated by circumstances beyond our control. General Heinz Guderian, architect of German armored doctrine, wrote in his memoirs, "When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, a quantity that meant everything to him, that seemed like salvation, and then learned it was nothing to the Americans, less than they burned in a single depot to deny it to us, the war was over. We were not fighting an army. We were fighting an industrial system that could outproduce our consumption." The story of Kampfgruppe Peiper resonates through military history because it represents the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion. The romantic notion of warfare, courage, tactical brilliance, warrior spirit determining outcomes, died in the Ardennes forests among abandoned tanks with empty fuel tanks. Dr. Richard Overy, the British historian who has studied the economics of World War II extensively, calculated that by 1944, Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-to-1 in virtually every major category of military equipment. In petroleum, the ratio approached 50-to-1. These advantages couldn't be overcome by superior training, better tactics, or even better equipment design. The mathematics were too overwhelming. Consider the production numbers that tell the story of industrial dominance. America produced 324,550 aircraft during World War II. Germany produced 119,907. American pilots flew aircraft that were adequately fueled, adequately maintained, and replaced when lost. German pilots by 1944 were flying aircraft that might have fuel for one mission, that lacked spare parts that couldn't be replaced when shot down. Americans built 88,410 tanks during the war. Germany produced 46,857, but more tellingly, American tanks consumed less fuel. Sherman tanks burned 0.8 gallons per mile, compared to the Tiger's 2.5 gallons per mile. American tanks were designed with logistics in mind. German tanks were designed for battlefield performance without adequate consideration for supply. But the most overwhelming statistic, America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, not for the entire war, but in a single year, while Germany scraped together 33 million barrels from all sources. The ratio wasn't close. It wasn't competitive. It was total dominance. December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve. As Peiper's surviving men slipped through American lines on foot, abandoning 39 operational tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment that German industry could not replace, the full magnitude of the failure crystallized. They had captured 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld, a quantity that had seemed miraculous, that had appeared to be the salvation of the offensive, only to learn it was meaningless to an enemy who could burn millions without concern. Unterscharführer Weber, Peiper's faithful driver, reflected on this in a 1975 interview, 3 decades after the events. That morning at Hansfeld, when we found the American fuel, we celebrated. Some men were crying with relief. We thought we'd won the lottery, that God had given us a miracle. By evening, when we learned about Stavelo burning, when we understood the scale of American logistics, we knew we'd already lost. The Americans had so much they could destroy what we would die to possess. The 50,000 gallons we thought would save us was pocket change to them. The mathematics told the brutal truth. The 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld was less than a single American armored division consumed in 2 days of operations. It was less than the Red Ball Express burned in 3 hours of routine logistics operations. It was a rounding error in Allied daily consumption of 7.5 million gallons. It was nothing. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding the American 7 Corps, later wrote in his memoirs about the German fuel crisis. The Germans' desperate attempts to capture our fuel depots revealed their fundamental miscalculation. They assumed we valued fuel as they did, as irreplaceable, as precious, as something to be hoarded and carefully rationed. They couldn't comprehend that we had so much we could burn millions of gallons rather than risk even a minor tactical disadvantage. That inability to comprehend our abundance was itself a strategic failure. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Battle of the Bulge as the Americans called it, failed through the immutable mathematics of industrial warfare. The offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons of fuel over 3 weeks. This was 40% over the initial allocation, with the difference coming from captured American supplies. During the same 3-week period, American forces in Europe consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times more. The disparity wasn't close. It wasn't competitive. It was absolute. The casualties told a story of German failure. The Wehrmacht lost approximately 100,000 men, killed, wounded, captured. They lost 800 tanks and assault guns, equipment that could not be replaced. They lost over 1,000 aircraft, losses that crippled the already weakened Luftwaffe. But the most devastating loss was the loss of illusions. Every German soldier who participated in the Ardennes offensive, every German commander who witnessed American abundance firsthand, understood that Germany wasn't fighting a war anymore. Germany was participating in its own execution. The outcome was predetermined by factors beyond courage or tactics. The American response to the German offensive demonstrated the reality of Allied dominance. Units were redeployed hundreds of miles in days. Surrounded forces at Bastogne were supplied by air. Patton's Third Army pivoted 90 degrees and attacked in strength within 72 hours. These operations, considered impossible by German standards, were executed routinely because fuel and supplies were unlimited. Joachim Peiper survived the war, imprisoned until 1956 for his role in the Malmedy massacre. He was released after serving 11 years of a life sentence, the sentence having been commuted due to questions about the fairness of his trial. He settled in France, living quietly under an assumed name, trying to escape his past. On July 14, 1976, Bastille Day, France's national holiday, unknown assailants firebombed his house. Peiper died in the fire. The attackers were never identified. French authorities suspected revenge for wartime atrocities, but the case was never solved. But before his death in 1967, Peiper granted an interview to British historian Henry Maule. The interview, one of the few times Peiper spoke publicly about his wartime experiences, contained revealing reflections. Finding that depot at Hansfeld was the worst thing that happened to us. If we'd run out of fuel earlier, we might have retreated with some dignity, with the belief that we'd been defeated by circumstances, by bad luck. Instead, we discovered the truth. We discovered that the Americans had oceans while we had drops. We discovered impossibility. We learned that we were fighting an enemy who could waste more than we could produce. That knowledge was worse than defeat. It was the death of hope. The lesson of Kampfgruppe Peiper extends far beyond World War II. It illuminates a fundamental truth about modern warfare. In industrial conflict between developed nations, logistics supersedes tactics. Production overwhelms courage. Abundance defeats dedication. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably the best trained soldier in the world. German officers were products of a military tradition going back to Prussia. German equipment, when it worked, was often technically superior to Allied equivalents. The Tiger tank could destroy a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even damage the Tiger. German machine guns fired faster. German small unit tactics were more sophisticated. None of it mattered. The Germans were backed by a failing industrial system that couldn't produce adequate fuel. The Americans were backed by an industrial machine so vast it could waste more than Germany could produce. This truth was encoded in every jerry can at Honsfeld, every gallon burned at Stavelot, every pipeline crossing France, every C-47 dropping fuel into Bastogne. Wars between industrial powers are won by factories and refineries, not by brilliant generals or courageous soldiers. Colonel Trevor Dupuy, the American military historian who developed the quantified judgment model for analyzing military effectiveness, calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier was supported by 67 pounds of supplies daily. Each German soldier received 3 pounds. Even if German soldiers were twice as effective individually, which Dupuy's research suggested they were, they couldn't overcome a 22-to-1 supply disadvantage. Americans complained about supply shortages when deliveries dropped to only 500,000 gallons daily. Germans would have considered such shortages unimaginable abundance. The perspectives were so different that the two armies might as well have been operating in different wars. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans from both sides gathered at L'Église for a commemoration ceremony. The small Belgian town had built a museum, and Peiper's King Tiger tank, the one he had personally destroyed on December 24, 1944, had been recovered and put on display. The tank sits where it was abandoned, fuel gauge on empty, a monument to the limits of tactical excellence when confronted by logistical reality. During the ceremony, former Unterscharführer Karl Wortmann stood beside the tank with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the American 30th Infantry Division. The two men, enemies 4 decades earlier, now old men reflecting on their youth, had a conversation that survivors remembered. "We always wondered why you stopped here," Anderson said, gesturing at the defensive positions around L'Église. "We thought it was a tactical decision. We prepared for a major battle, brought up reserves, artillery. Then you just sat there. We couldn't understand it." Wortmann laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "We stopped because the tanks were empty, no fuel. You burned millions of gallons at Stavelot to keep it from us. We had enough fuel to defend this position or to retreat, but not both. How could we fight that? How could anyone fight an enemy who has so much they burn it rather than let us have it?" Anderson was quiet for a long moment, looking at the massive tank with its 88mm gun. "We never knew you were that short on fuel. We had so much we never even thought about it. Fuel was just there, always there. I remember we left engines running all the time in the cold, just for heat. Never occurred to us you were counting every gallon." That exchange captured the truth of December 1944 more effectively than any military analysis. One side measured fuel by the gallon, rationing every drop, calculating every mile. The other side measured by millions of gallons, burning fuel casually, never giving it thought. One side fought for each jerry can as if it were gold. The other side burned entire oceans of fuel and barely noticed. The outcome was predetermined by these differences. German military records provide damning evidence of the inevitable failure. Army Group B's War Diary for December 1944 tells the story in stark entries. December 16th, 0530 hours. Offensive begins. Fuel status, 70% of minimum required levels. Weather overcast, good for ground operations. December 17th, 1200 hours. Kampfgruppe Peiper reports capture of 50,000 gallons at Honsfeld. All units report fuel critical. December 18th, 1800 hours. Multiple American depots destroyed by enemy engineers. Estimated 5+ million gallons lost. Fuel situation catastrophic. December 19th, 0900 hours. Fuel critical across entire offensive front. Multiple units immobilized. Air resupply impossible due to fuel shortages for Luftwaffe. December 24th, 2000 hours. Kampfgruppe Peiper abandons all vehicles. Fuel exhaustion, breaking out on foot. Meanwhile, American First Army reports for the same period paint a completely different picture. December 16th, fuel reserves, 3.7 million gallons. Weather halts deliveries temporarily. December 17th, emergency destruction of 2.2 million gallons at various depots to deny enemy access. December 18th, weather improves. Received 1.8 million gallons. Reserves increasing. December 24th, current reserves, 4.1 million gallons. Daily consumption normal. No supply difficulties. the Americans treated millions of gallons with the casual indifference that Germans reserved for individual cans. When American logistics officers reported fuel levels, they rounded to the nearest 100,000 gallons because smaller amounts weren't worth tracking. German logistics officers tracked individual vehicles, individual missions, individual gallons. Beyond the sheer quantity, American fuel represented technological superiority that compounded Germany's disadvantage. American refineries had perfected catalytic cracking, a process that produced higher octane gasoline more efficiently than the German hydrogenation process. American 100-octane aviation fuel gave Allied aircraft significant performance advantages over German planes running on 87-octane synthetic fuel. American refiners had also perfected fuel additives that German chemists couldn't replicate: tetraethyl, lead for octane boost; ethylene dibromide as a lead scavenger; detergents to prevent engine deposits. These additives, products of America's sophisticated petrochemical industry, gave American fuel superior performance characteristics. German engines designed for lower quality fuel often ran poorly on captured American gasoline, suffering from pre-ignition and carbon buildup. The fuel shortage shaped every aspect of the German soldiers' experience in ways that went beyond tactical operations. Grenadier Hans Müller of the 12th SS Panzer Division recorded in his diary on December 20th, "Marched 30 kilometers today. No fuel for trucks. Cold beyond description. Past abandoned American vehicles. Engines still running to keep them warm. They leave engines running while we march through snow. They waste fuel for convenience while we freeze." Medical services were crippled by fuel shortages in ways that cost lives. Ambulances couldn't evacuate wounded. Field hospitals couldn't run generators for lighting and heating. Medical supplies couldn't be distributed effectively. Men died waiting for transportation that never came because there was no fuel for the ambulances. Oberarzt Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting, a Wehrmacht surgeon, testified after the war. "We had excellent surgeons, adequate medical supplies, much of it captured from the Americans. We had the knowledge and equipment to save lives, but we had no fuel for ambulances. Men with treatable wounds died waiting for evacuation that required 10 kilometers of travel. 10 kilometers we couldn't provide. I watched men bleed to death, not from lack of medical care, but from lack of gasoline." The discoveries that Kampfgruppe Peiper made about American logistics shattered German propaganda narratives about American weakness and inferiority. For years, German soldiers had been told that Americans were soft, that they lacked fighting spirit, that they would collapse under pressure. Then these same soldiers encountered American abundance and realized the propaganda was worse than false. It had blinded Germany to the real threat. Soldiers who had believed in German superiority discovered that Americans could destroy more resources than Germany possessed. This revelation undermined faith in leadership, in ideology, in the cause itself. Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, noted the problem in his diary entry for December 28th. Reports from the Ardennes indicate serious morale problems among our forces. Soldiers are writing letters home, describing American material superiority in ways that undermine our narrative. The censors are catching these letters, but the knowledge spreads anyway. Soldiers returning on leave bring stories about American abundance. This is more dangerous than military defeats, but the stories spread faster than censorship could contain them. The myth of German superiority, the racial ideology that underpinned the Nazi state, couldn't survive contact with the reality of American logistics. Every German soldier who saw Americans casually waste resources that Germans would treasure carried that knowledge back to other units, to the home front, to the broader population. The Ardennes failure meant Germany had exhausted its last reserves and had no options remaining except desperate defense. General Alfred Jodl, chief of operations at OKW, testified at Nuremberg. "After the Ardennes, after we'd committed our last reserves and failed, we knew it was over. We'd played our last card and discovered the enemy held all the aces. From January 1945 onward, We were simply prolonging the inevitable. Recognizing German desperation and the importance of denying fuel, the Allies intensified their focus on destroying Germany's remaining fuel production capacity. By February 1945, German synthetic fuel production had effectively ceased. The few plants still operating produced negligible amounts. The consequences were immediate and total. The Luftwaffe was grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Advanced jet aircraft, like the Me-262, potentially war-changing technology, sat immobile for lack of fuel. Pilot training was canceled entirely. The Wehrmacht became essentially a static force, unable to maneuver, unable to concentrate forces, destroyed piecemeal by mobile Allied armies. Spring 1945 brought surreal scenes across Germany. German units surrendered not from battlefield defeat, but from inability to move. Entire panzer divisions with operational tanks, experienced crews, and adequate ammunition sat helplessly as Allied forces bypassed them. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer-Lehr Division, described the situation in April 1945. We had 42 operational tanks. We had veteran crews who had survived years of combat. We had ammunition stockpiles. We had everything except the one thing we needed: fuel. We had perhaps 300 liters total, not enough to move to the next town, 10 kilometers away. We destroyed our tanks with demolition charges and walked into captivity. The most powerful armored division in the Wehrmacht, destroyed by empty fuel tanks. Meanwhile, the American advance across Germany was constrained only by traffic jams created by the abundance of vehicles. Patton's Third Army alone operated over 15,000 vehicles. Fuel trucks followed combat units, ensuring tanks never ran dry. The Americans advanced as fast as they could drive, limited only by road capacity, never by logistics. The fuel crisis that destroyed Kampfgruppe Peiper demonstrates how industrial capacity determined World War II's outcome in the West. When Peiper stood among those captured jerry cans on the morning of December 17, 1944, watching his men refuel with desperate efficiency, he glimpsed a truth that German leadership refused to accept. They were fighting an enemy whose casual waste exceeded German production. The numbers tell the complete story. German offensive allocation: 5 million gallons, only 2.5 million actually delivered. Fuel captured by Germans during offensive: approximately 60,000 gallons. Fuel destroyed by Americans to deny capture: 8 million gallons, American daily consumption during offensive. 7.5 million gallons, American daily receipts during offensive. 8.2 million gallons, Peiper's capture at Hansfeld. 50,000 gallons, percentage of American daily supply, 0.67%. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans, wounded 47,500 more, and left 23,000 missing or captured. German casualties were even higher, perhaps 100,000 killed, wounded, or captured. The offensive destroyed the Wehrmacht's last strategic reserves: tanks, aircraft, trained soldiers that Germany could not replace. But the offensive's lasting impact was the knowledge it spread through German ranks. Every soldier who participated, every officer who witnessed American abundance, understood that Germany possessed no path to victory. America had incomprehensible material wealth. The outcome was mathematically certain. Peiper's discovery wasn't just about fuel. It was about the fundamental nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. Victory belonged to whoever could produce and deliver the most petroleum, steel, aluminum, and manufactured goods. All other factors, tactics, training, courage, even technical sophistication, were secondary to industrial capacity. Germany never had a realistic chance of winning World War II once it engaged the combined industrial power of the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British Empire. The question was never if Germany would lose, but when and at what cost. The final irony of Kampfgruppe Peiper's fuel crisis emerged when American forces cataloged abandoned German equipment at La Glaise after the battle. They found 39 tanks in various states of mechanical condition. Most were operational or required only minor repairs. All were abandoned for lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison of the 740th Tank Battalion, assigned to evaluate the abandoned German equipment, filed a salvage report that included a casual notation that speaks volumes. Fuel required to recover and relocate vehicles, approximately 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal requisition. Source, local reserves. Estimated time to fulfill, 4 hours. What was impossible for the Germans, 8,000 gallons, to save their most powerful tanks, was beneath American notice. A minimal requisition. Local reserves, 4 hours. The amount of fuel that would have saved Kampfgruppe Peiper, that would have allowed them to continue operations or execute a proper fighting retreat, was described by American logistics as minimal. The Tiger tank that sits in Leglaise's museum today, Piper's command tank numbered 213, has its fuel gauge visible to visitors. The needle points to empty. It's a monument more powerful than any designed memorial, a testament to the moment when tactical excellence met logistical reality and lost. Visitors to the museum, standing before this massive machine with its thick armor and powerful gun, often ask the guides the same question. Why did they abandon such powerful tanks? The answer is always the same, simple and complete: no fuel. This was Piper's discovery at Hansfeld on that cold December morning in 1944. Not just that America had more fuel, but that American abundance operated on a scale so vast that German scarcity was rendered completely irrelevant. The 50,000 gallons that seemed like salvation was nothing, a rounding error, a minor depot, an amount Americans would burn without hesitation rather than risk capture. The war was over when American industrial capacity fully mobilized. Hansfeld revealed what had been true since 1942, what the statistics had shown, but German leadership refused to accept. Germany was fighting the impossible. Germany was measuring defeat in gallons, while America measured victory in oceans. The Tiger tank sits silent in Belgium, its fuel gauge empty, its story complete. It speaks to every generation about the reality of industrial warfare, about the limitations of tactical brilliance when confronted by strategic impossibility, about the mathematics that determine World War II's outcome more surely than any battle. The answer to why such powerful tanks were abandoned remains simple, undeniable, and complete: no fuel.